Welcome back. So in this fourth part of the series, what we need to understand is auditing with respect to events, or auditing using events. Now what exactly audit means? It's like kind of maybe after calculations or kind of log entries made once the event happens, once something gets called, or once significant functionalities get called. So for example, in databases, we have a concept called as trigger, which is like on insert, on update kind of triggers, which is like whenever some sort of a record gets inserted into a table, we always can have, whenever the record rather gets inserted into a table, we can have a trigger, and then that trigger will automatically be fired whenever some insertion happens, or maybe updation happens or deletion happens. And then normally we end up writing some code with respect to trigger, that is some audit entry, like so and so user has done so and so kind of changes at so and so time. So those log entries can be helpful later on just to understand if there are maybe some good events or bad events with respect to databases. One can very well use these log entries to do the tally. So how are we going to use maybe auditing with respect to events? So for this example, I'm going to use C#, and I'll be using event concept in case of C#. So let's understand the problem statement first. So what we need to do is we need to define some utility. It can be a class library. However, I'm going to want to create a console application. Later on, we can move the code into class library. So we're looking for some DB operations related utility, which will help user to connect to any database out of MySQL, Oracle, MySQL, or MS SQL, and maybe it can be anything else. And then we want some functionalities with respect to insert, update, delete. So it's very clear, that is, we may need some class which will have some functionalities like insert, update, delete. We may have some connect related maybe code. It can be inside a constructor. It can be when the first operation gets called. It's up to us. However, as we discussed in earlier statements as well, what doesn't matter is the logic in this case. What matters is the structuring of the classes. Then in that utility, what we want to do is we would like to build, maybe based on that utility, we need to build some sort of applications further, so that that application or utility can be used further for doing the operations like CRUD operations. It means if we make this as a class library, people can use it in console, Windows, or web applications. Then in this case, if at all there is a DB operation which gets called, simplest example, maybe insert, then after that what we want to do is, in databases, just like we can have triggers, what we want to do is we want to raise an event, which can be after update, after delete, after insert. So more like a trigger, we need an event in case of C#. So at the application's end, what we want to do is we want to raise an event as and when the respective function gets called. Then after this event gets called, we would like to attach a kind of, you can say, functionality with respect to event, which is called as the event handler. In case of Java, it is called as action listener, and the event can be called as action. So in this case, we need an event handler which ultimately will do the logging of the messages, which means after update, we would like to write down maybe into the file that is so and so maybe data gets inserted, maybe so and so data gets updated, so and so data got deleted, and so on. And ultimately, to log down those messages, one can use logger, one can use customized functions, or one can use some sort of third-party APIs as well. So ultimately, whenever something like the function gets called, the event gets triggered. So raising event is just like compulsory in here. Similar way, handling of that event is also going to be compulsory, because if you don't handle the event, you are going to end up in object reference not set to instance of an object kind of exception. So ultimately, kind of logging is compulsory, but how do you do the logging, that is completely up to you. So there are two kind of developers who can participate in this program. One who is going to define the DBOps utility, which can be a DLL, and then other one who is going to use this DBOps utility for maybe calling insert, update, delete like functions. However, in order to call these functions insert, update, delete, one will also have to write down event handler or handle the event using event handler. The event handler can be, in this case, can be a custom function, or it can be a simple loggers log method that we saw in the previous problem statement. So let's try to understand this problem statement more in detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to Visual Studio. We already have this log lib available. So instead of that, let me, I already have unloaded this project. Let me add a new project now, which is going to be console application. Later on, we can move this code into maybe class library. So I'm going to create a console application using .NET Framework. Let's call it as demo number 4. So demo 04. Now, in here, what we want to do is, like earlier cases, I'm going to club this program class, and then I'm going to add a new class. So let's take a very simple example first. So we are looking for, let's say, instead of talking about variety of functionalities, variety of maybe databases, let's take an example of one class at a time. So let's take an example of, we have a class, let's call it as MySQL. And with respect to this class, one entity, I would like to have one functionality. Let's say I need to have a functionality, let's call it as void insert. Though insert should return some sort of integer like number of rows affected, but then, as I said earlier as well, we are not interested in actually writing a logic, we are interested in structuring the program content. So insert, some data can be there. As of now, I can just have some string data here. And then maybe on a console, I can just end up writing MySQL insert done or insert called. Okay, so simple MySQL class, simple insert function, some data you can pass, and we will see something getting printed on the console. Okay, let's try to call this. So let's create an object of MySQL equal to new MySQL and call object dot insert method. Let's pass on some data and let's see what happens now. So when we run this project, we'll see on the console MySQL insert called. So actual logic can be part of this function. So actual logic here. Not interested in writing that logic. So just like this, what we are also interested in is we need to raise an event in here itself. So imagine a scene if we actually go and try to raise the event. Now what is a raising event in this case? Just like a class can have constructors, class can have functions, class can have data setters. Similar way in C# class can have events. So I am going to define one event here, which is, let's say, going to use some sort of delegate. So ultimately a function pointer. So some delegate I'll put up here as public event. Let's give a name as after insert. And then whenever this after insert event is going to get raised. So once actual logic like this gets executed, I would like to simply raise an alarm from here, like after insert is what we need to call. So ultimately it's kind of a notification to the CLR that since this function is almost called, ultimately we are just going to go and raise an alarm to CLR saying that is after insert needs to be called now. And then since after insert is an event, somebody who is using this myClass object will have to write down the code with respect to after insert. But then how that person who is writing a program class or a main method, how that person is going to go and write down the code for after insert? Since it's an event, ultimately we need some event handler over here. So let's take an example. Suppose if I go and if I write down some simple function, I'm just going to go and write down simple static function. Static, why? Because I need to call, like main needs to call the static function. So main is static. Ultimately I'm going to call a function directly, so it can be a static function here. So I'm just going to go and write down static. Nothing great about it. You can always write this function which we are going to go and write down. We can write this function inside some other class. We can create an object and we can very well call it. But then it's just simple to understand we don't have to keep on switching the files. That is the reason I'm going to go and write it here itself. So a static function which is going to go and return void, and which is going to go and say simple, maybe after insert call me. This is the function that we have. And maybe I'm looking for some input, like MySQL maybe did the, what we call it as, MySQL did the insert job, MySQL did the update job, kind of you can say logging I just need. So here is what we can do. Either we can pass some parameter in case we need it, or simplest example is we can very well just keep it as it is. I'm going to put on a console here something like maybe insert done, and this is an audit entry, so I'm just going to go and put up maybe 1 plus insert done at, and I'm going to write down date time dot now dot to string. Simple. So this particular function I would like to call as and when this insert gets called. Obviously this function is available with the program class. Are we really going to go and call program dot after insert? Absolutely no. Since we already have declared object of MySQL over here, I want to tell to the CLR that whenever this object dot insert gets called, there is an event that we are trying to raise which needs to be handled. So here is how we make an entry. So object dot, there's going to be something called as after insert. After insert needs a complete declaration. So MySQL has this event called after insert. You can see the zigzag line is going to go and tell you that after insert is something which is incomplete. A zigzag line is going to tell you that there is something wrong with the code. And what is wrong with the code is we are yet to convey, like, this is the signature of the function that we will need. We already have authored a function and now we are looking for a signature. So here is what I'm going to go and do. I'm just going to go and specify something like, since the function doesn't return anything, it's void, I'm going to use one inbuilt kind of, you can say, function pointer, which is called as action. So what does that mean is, we want CLR to understand that whenever after insert kind of an event gets raised, please look for a pointer of type action, which is going to go and point to some method like this, and then that method needs to be called as and when the event gets raised. Okay, how do I handle this? Here we go. I'm just going to go and specify object dot. You will find out there is an event which we already have exposed publicly, that is here. I'm going to specify whenever this event happens after insert, I would like to attach. Either we can say here new action, and it expects a parameter which is a function which returns void and takes no parameter. I already have something which returns void and which takes no parameter. So we can simply specify here after insert call me like this, or second option, instead of fully typing all this, we have a shorthand syntax like this. So it's like we are trying to tell CLR, that is, I already have MySQL object. Whenever this object is going to go and raise a concern or raise an alarm, that is after insert has happened. Whenever after insert happens, ultimately I want CLR to understand, that is, there is a function called after insert call me which it needs to call. So we are just ensuring that CLR knows what to call whenever something happens. And then actually this insert happens. So whenever insert happens, you pass the parameter, insert happens, you print something, you execute some logic, and then you raise an alarm to CLR like after insert, which means something has happened. And then CLR will simply find out with respect to object if we have already conveyed what after insert means, and if we already have conveyed like what function to call, there will be a call automatically given to this method after the event gets raised. So through function pointer, obviously. So in this case, this action is actually acting as a function pointer. So if I run this code, let's see what we get. So MySQL insert called and insert done at this time is what is conveyed. Okay, fair enough. But what will happen if I don't maybe write this code? What if I simply call insert method? Let's run this and see what happens. If I run this, you will find out now insert gets called, this logic gets called, but then since I'm raising an alarm, now if you look at the details, we have object reference not set to instance of an object. if you just try to go to view details, you will find out in here the exception occurs from the application itself, that is object reference not set to as instance of an object. It means right now we raised the alarm, but then somehow we forgot to mention on that alarm what is the action which needs to be taken, and then it fails. That's the reason it's kind of compulsory to specify here like what needs to happen after the alarm is raised. Okay, now instead of going into the you can say details of events, function pointers, that is delegates, and event handlers over here, let's focus on the problem statement. So we have done with respect to MySQL is I defined the event, I defined the method, and I'm just raising the alarm. Okay, now let's say similar thing I need to do with respect to other database class as well. So I'm going to copy this class, I'm going to paste it here, and then I'm going to make it as Oracle. Now when it comes to Oracle, I'm looking for something similar, I'm looking for same signature, I'm looking for some different implementation in here. And then I'm actually looking for raising the same sort of functionality again. So ultimately, just like I raised here code with respect to MySQL or event with respect to MySQL, I'm looking for code with respect to Oracle now. Now please understand this. Right now, if I just call Oracle specific functionality, we will find out Oracle insert gets called and insert done at this time. Okay, fair enough. This looks like it's just a simple copy paste, but then this is not a good code. Reason behind that, if you notice, I have copied this code, I tried to paste this code over here, and this is a concern now. Reason behind that, both the classes that we have, I have actually too much of code in common. So let's identify something common and let's try to take it into the base. As we already know, the best option to work with writing or designing classes is define the leaf level classes first, identify something common, and then construct a base out of it. So let's try to write down one base here. So I'm looking for one base class. Let's call it as database. Then in here, there is something common that you will find out. There is this insert method, which is kind of, you can say, common to all. So logic is different. Here logic is different. Here logic is different. But then signature of the method remains common. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and have a declaration here. Okay, all good. If it's only declaration inside the class, ultimately, if it's only declaration we are looking for and no definition, ultimately we can plan to have this as an interface. Okay, hold on. Is there anything common or anything else as a common? Yes, there is one event as well, which is common. So let me take this event as well in the base. So we have this event also declared. What if I remove this from here? What if I remove this from here? Okay, all good. Now comes other problem. So this after insert kind of against a method or event is not available here. It's going to go and come down from base. So I'm going to inherit MySQL from database class or database interface for that matter. Now if I inherit this from maybe database, whether it's an interface or whether it is a class, ultimately the problem is you will notice if you look at the logic, after insert is always going to get called at a sequence thing, which is after the almost entire execution is done, then the after insert is called, which means it's not a sequence of methods like what we saw in the report builder kind of a example, which is problem statement number 2. Rather, it's a sequence of logic or lines of code that you will notice now. And then every time we are calling after insert, after the insert is exactly done. How do we ensure this then? Because we know this, that is, we can assure a sequence of methods with the help of some maybe abstract base. How do I go and maybe ensure a code like this then? Okay, here we go. We have a way out. In order to ensure that something or some piece of code always gets called at a respective location like this, ultimately what we can plan to do is we are anyway going to go and force this MySQL or Oracle classes to write down or implement insert method, because we have taken this method here. Let me declare this method as an abstract method. So abstract void. Now obviously Do we want people to call this? Maybe. If people need to call this method, ultimately this can be simple public method. So public abstract, we can always have here public abstract declared. And then ultimately the person who is going to go and implement this database will have to end up writing here override. So I'll have override. I'll also have here override. So seems good as of now. I have an insert, and then this class needs to be abstract class because it's just a declaration. There's no common logic that we have. So abstract class database has an abstract method which is compulsory to be implemented here, and then comes up event in this case. Now this event, if I'm just trying to call this event, as of now it's private to this class. Let me make it public. If I make it public here, let's try to see what this has to say. If I carry a cursor here, it's trying to tell you that after insert can only appear on the left hand side of plus equal to or minus equal to, which means attach or detach in this case. Why is that happening? If I keep this after insert in here, the zigzag line is gone. But if I put this after insert in the base, you will find out this is going to create a problem. A reason behind that? In case of C#, whenever some event is declared inside particular class, that event needs to be raised from that class itself. You can simply go and maybe have a declaration in some X class and then maybe raising, or so-called you can say maybe raising a kind of an event job to be done in case of, you can say, derived classes. So now the problem is after insert, if it is so common and if it is declared in the base, it needs to be actually called like this in the base itself. Okay, here's what I have a plan now. I'm going to write down one more method which is going to be a simple public method. Let's call it as public void, let's say insert into db. This method is going to go and take the string data as a parameter. Kindly note the structuring. Ultimately, this insert into db is going to go and give a call to insert, more like a sequence thing we saw in report builder. I'm going to go and pass on data as it is as a parameter here. So somebody will give a call to insert into db, we'll pass on the data. Since it's a public method, I'll take that data and pass it on further to insert, which is declared here but defined here. And then once the insert method is almost done or done, I'm going to go and raise this after insert. So I'm going to call after insert over here itself. Is it good? That is, we actually call the entire method and then I'm going to go and raise the alarm. So ultimately, we don't have to keep on calling this after insert over here. Neither we have to go and we call this insert over here. And now if you look at the code, MySQL is doing only the business which it is supposed to. Oracle is doing the business which it is supposed to do. So ultimately, it's just plain insertion in Oracle and MySQL. And then these classes or the class writers don't have to worry about what kind of, you can say, maybe event is going to get raised. None of, the MySQL class writers business or Oracle class writers business. Ultimately, they are supposed to simply write down the code which is for insertion, updation and deletion. And ultimately, base is going to go and take care of raising the event in this case. Okay, all good. What will happen if can I create a database class object? No, because it is abstract, because it has got abstract function. Okay. How do I give a call to this insert into db? It's publicly available. But what will happen to this function then? Is it not true that we will have two public functions available? Insert into db, which is doing the insert thing and then raising the event, and then other insert, which is simple public function, which is actually not raising the event in here. So ultimately we need to fix that because there will be confusion whether to call insert into db or whether to call insert. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to expose this method as it is getting called internally here. I'm going to make this protected, just like the way we did in the report builder code. So I have a protected override now over here. So ultimately, any class writer will simply have to implement this database class, abstract class function like insert, will end up writing the actual logic. And then what happens when this logic gets called, that is something which is not the MySQL class writer's concern or Oracle class writer's concern. Okay, how do I use this then? Ultimately, when you create an object of, let me put it here. If I have MySQL class object created, I don't have an insert method available for calling. Please have a look. If I put dot, I have insert into db method available only. Here also I'll have object 1, object 1, object 1, and then I'll have insert into DB kind of method available for calling purpose. So I'm creating MySQL class object, Oracle class object. To each of the class object, I'm just going to go and specify, please call this method. And ultimately, this after insert for MySQL is differently handled, and then Oracle it is differently handled. You can try having different methods like this for insertion into Oracle or maybe for MySQL and so on. Let's run and see what you get. So there is a MySQL insert called and then insert done as this time. There is an Oracle insert called and it is done at this time. Okay, if we are simply logging the things right now, do I really need this kind of a method in the first place? What if I remove this method from here, and what if I start using here a logger? If you recall, there was a logger that we created some time back. So I'm just going to go and reload this project. I'm going to refer in demo 4 that log file. Let's add a reference to loglib. Let's add a reference to loglib. And now you will notice instead of calling after insert call me, I'm just going to go and use the logger dot current logger dot the method that we wanted to call was log. So ultimately I am just going to go and specify, okay, log doesn't match the signature because after insert call me was not taking any parameter, if you recall. And then this method which is called as log actually expects a parameter. Ideally we should send something which is going to be maybe some sort of detail, like, you know, maybe MySQL did the maybe insertion or Oracle did the insertion and so on. Okay, how do I ensure this? Because after insert is not something that we are calling. It is something that it is getting raised after the insertion is done. What if I actually decide here that I need to pass a parameter? Fair enough. You can always go and pass on the parameter. You can expect here a signature like I'm looking for action, which is going to expect a parameter in this case. So we can specify it's an action with respect to some input parameter. Up to 16 different input entries we can pass on with void return type. So I'm going to specify a function pointer which will expect a parameter of type string, some message. Okay, sorry, string. And then here I can just expect something like some parameter which can be, let's say, now the concern will be if I pass on here MySQL, every time I am going to go and get into the log MySQL word. If I copy this, if I paste it here, every time the insertion happens or insert into DB happens, it's going to go and call either MySQL insert or Oracle insert function, which is here. But whenever after insert gets raised, we are hard coding here MySQL. So ultimately, after insert, whenever this log method gets called, I am going to go and always get hard coded MySQL. Please have a look. If I run this code, you'll always notice logger created. There was a kind of, you can say, constructor entry that we created in the last demonstration. So MySQL insert gets called and then MySQL at so and so, because MySQL was a word that we passed on as a message. In both the cases, there is a word passed called as MySQL, and now that's a concern for us because MySQL should not be hard coded. Here, I really want whose insert method is getting called over here. Based on that, I need a MySQL or Oracle word here. Now that's going to be the difficult thing, because here ultimately we will be involving some if-else statements then. Okay, not a concern. Ultimately, we want our classes to be like such that how many derived classes we have, it should not be like, you know, a concern for database class. So I'm not going to go and hardcode here MySQL or Oracle. Neither I'm going to go and have if-else statement or switch cases. How do I do this? Imagine we can always go and force the derived classes to end up maybe writing some methods by simply making those methods abstract. In case of interfaces, it's like you can say compulsory, we can make it. So similar way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one more abstract method, protected abstract string, and then let's call it as db name or get db name. And then this particular abstract method which returns a string is what I'm going to go and call over here. So I'm going to call this dot get db name or simple get db name. Now this function is going to go and return me the actual database name. Then is it not compulsory for derived classes to implement this method. So derived class will have to compulsorily implement this method. Let's write down protected and override. And then here I have to compulsorily return something. So we will ask the developer to actually go and return the name of the class or the name of the database itself. So this developer will have to end up, and this developer will have to end up writing similar kind of a code. But however, implementation will be the class name or the database name itself. So now if you look at the function or code, this particular entire code is independent of whether we are writing code with respect to MySQL or Oracle. So this code is going to go and get database name from the derived itself. So now if I run this code, please have a look. There's a logger created, MySQL insert called, and then there's a log. There's Oracle insert called, and there is a Oracle log that we have. So you'll find out there is a problem to every solution that we have. Ultimately, what you need to define is you have to understand what sort of base will be good for you. Is it going to be abstract class? Is it going to be interface? What sort of method signature you should have? You should have public, private, or protected. You should think about it. And then while you make something maybe common, think about it. That is, if it is common, then it should remain common. It should not have any kind of, you can say, code which is with respect to some sort of condition check. That is, if that derived comes up, if this derived comes up, then how will we end up writing code? Then your base is going to be useless. So ultimately what we have to understand, we have to always write a base which should be common. We should not keep on maybe adding or keep on piling up some sort of content into the base just because derived needs it. No. Base should be independent of the derived. And then just because some common things are there, that's the reason you should have thought of defining a base. So if we go back to our slideshow, it's going to be takeaway like we just try to understand how do we raise the events. Then we just try to understand events and the base class. Ultimately, events declared in particular class needs to be raised in that class itself. And then how do we handle the events from the base itself is what we try to understand. So in this discussion, we just try to maybe handle the events and we try to somehow associate it with the logger. Now, as I said, you can use logger, you can use that custom function called as after insert call me or similar functions like that in order to handle the events. So here we are going to go and end up this session. The next discussion is going to be all about sealed functionalities. So you might wonder, like people have like the knowledge like, final in case of Java is something like, you can't inherit the class. In case of sealed in C#, ultimately you can't inherit that class. Why exactly are we looking for sealed in the first place? In case of OOP concepts, one of the pillars that we have is inheritance. So is it not true that we are going to go and defeat this base concept itself? That is, at one hand or one end, we are saying that is inheritance should be there all the time. And then in the other hand, we are saying the inheritance should be banned using sealed. Why will I actually go and have something sealed or final? So we need to understand that through some example. That will be in the next discussion. Thank you.